Hi and welcome to Tuesday's video. I'm going to make this a short video. Let's see if I need to mention anything from last time that I forgot to talk about. I know Panasonic. There is a Panasonic reading. It's, I think, one of the more important ones. Coevolution. Coevolution of an approach inside Panasonic that tried to understand a new market, which was China, and at the same time that their understanding of the market in China was growing, their understanding of what the company could actually do outside of China in other markets and in Japan grew at the same time. What the author is saying is really quite important because it's a holistic view. That is to say, it's more than just look over here at this market and how can we learn about it. We'll talk a lot about that in this class. That's one part. The other part is how can we learn not only about this market, but about our own capabilities over here so that when we go to China and learn about the appliance market there, when we learn that our refrigerators are too big for Chinese kitchens, when we learn that if we put together a Chinese team that really understands China over here, that ability to learn new things can strengthen the company back in Japan and even result in some new products on the Japanese side. Didn't talk much at all about that. I think I mentioned it. Please do that reading. Today, what I'm going to do is very quickly talk about a few key concepts that will help you as an international marketer. One is the idea of experience near versus experience distant. How do you learn? Do you learn up close? Or do you learn better by getting the big view? A view that's up close where people live, or a view where you have access to lots of data and can sort of generalize about markets, household size, income, economy, all those big picture things. Well, what I'm going to suggest is you move back and forth. Second point is the idea of rich points. When you move from Japan to China, you may meet some surprises. Those surprises are rich points. And rich points are really important when people are crossing cultural boundaries and doing things in business. We'll talk about that. It's a Mike Agar idea. Speaking of Mike Agar, we'll talk about the idea of culture as a relational concept. It's not just the strange things I see over here. It's the fact that I'm doing the seeing. You see what I'm saying? We'll talk more about that. Relational concepts, important idea. We'll also talk about another way of looking at culture, one that's very common in international business. It's called the dimensional model of culture. And we'll talk about a fellow named Hofstad, whose work has been very important for international marketers and for business studies generally. And we'll tie that together after talking about cultural universals a little bit, what everyone has in common. We'll tie that together with kind of an integrative view of culture. So today is Culture Day. I'm an anthropologist. I think I mentioned that to you. My own experience was running a small market research firm that focused on international questions for large multinational corporations doing business around the world. So I've done a lot of this kind of research work in China to help companies understand how the Chinese brush their teeth and use oral care products, how young Chinese people learn to use computers and the internet, or how newly middle-class families in Brazil come to understand and use computer products like printers, for example, and a bunch of other things. So I'm going to start off with a notion of rich points for a second. You know, this last summer I was in Guangzhou, and I've been to China many times, and I was very surprised when I crossed the street and I couldn't get across the street. And I thought, wow, someone must have invented a wonderful new bike that's really cheap that everyone wants to use. That's what I thought. Then some friends of mine invited me out to dinner. And they said, let's meet at the Walmart. So we went to the Walmart in an apartment complex. We met there. And I said, well, where are we going to eat? They said, oh, it's about 2 miles away. I said, great, let's get a cab. I said, what do you need a cab for? Let's rent a bicycle. I said, where's the bicycle rental stand? I don't see a line of rental bikes. They said, oh no, the bikes are right under your nose. You can rent them anywhere and leave them anywhere. For me, this was a rich point. I didn't understand the new model of bicycle rental, which by now, of course, is in San Francisco, Seattle, perhaps in Korea as well. You don't need a special stand. You can pick them up and leave them anywhere. You pick up the bike, you look on your cell phone, scan the QR code on the bicycle, right? The computer and the cloud knows where the bike is. You get access to the bike. You've pre-registered. You pay 50 cents an hour. Take the bike to the restaurant, leave the bike, hit the computer. The company knows you've left the bike there. I thought I understood what was going on in China. Didn't have a clue because I didn't understand the whole context. That was a rich point, and I resolved it. So as we move into other cultures, or as you as a marketer do that, you're going to encounter rich points. Rich points are not something weird about that culture. Something weird about my encounter with that culture over there. So that's the first concept. The second one is this idea of stepping way back or getting up when close. The point about these points of view, experience distant versus experience near. If you like, experience distant, far away, bird's eye view versus experience near, up close and personal. These are different perspectives on the same reality. The reality that's being described in some ways is a bit different. The point of view is different, so the reality that's perceived and understood is different. These concepts are important as we get to talk about contextual intelligence, and you'll have a reading about that either today or tomorrow that kind of opens up the idea of how do you bridge these two approaches. Marketers use whatever data is at hand, especially important for international marketers where often we're called upon to understand a market that doesn't have a lot of experience distant data, or where the data is somehow suspect. You don't know how it was collected, maybe it's not so accurate. So you need to play around with both levels. That's the point. Let me switch gears for a second and talk about a theorist who's very important in the social sciences, a guy named Bourdieu. Bourdieu was actually an anthropologist by training, became a sociologist by his academic appointment later. He studied Algerians while he was in the army. As you know, there was an Algerian civil war. The French were involved in trying to calm things down and keep their former colony in line. And some of his ideas have been tremendously important for marketers. Let me give you just two of them. Well, three. The first idea is the one discussed by Gillian Tett in her first chapter of her book about organizational silos. You know how organizations often have some departments that don't talk to other departments, and then things don't go so well. She's writing a book about that and introduces it by talking about Bourdieu and this idea that for him, understanding cultural classification systems, the way people organize their understandings of what is normal, right, good taste, bad taste, good for breakfast, bad for breakfast, all this is cultural categories. Every culture does it differently. Bourdieu also came up with two key ideas. Besides discussing this long-standing interest that anthropologists and cognitive scientists have in cultural classifications or cognitive categories. Besides that, he came up with two ideas. One is the idea of cultural capital, not financial capital, but cultural capital, and social capital. Not financial, but other kinds of capital. Cultural capital is your knowledge, the knowledge that you have about the world. If you're an electrician, you have a lot of cultural capital about how houses are built and how electrical systems are put together. If you have a lot of, social capital, you have a wide network of people who can help you get things done. Cultural capital is kind of knowledge, right? The other side is the social capital. Who you know shapes what you know and who you are. Social capital is your network of friends, relations, and other people you can draw on for emotional support, for fiscal support, for learning, for all the stuff that it takes to get living done. Both these concepts are really important for marketers. For Bourdieu, he's looking at it as a social scientist. Marketers can take this idea and put them to work, these ideas and put them to work. It helps us understand how different groups of people approach the world differently, how they have different tastes because of the people around them, because of the knowledge that they have with them. And it helps kind of open up our understanding of things like social class that don't always hinge only on your economic power, but also on your cultural and social kinds of capital. Cultural capital, what you know, social capital, who you know. You can hear the emphasis there about practices. What people actually do is really key for a lot of Bourdieu's work. Agar's notion of culture is different from having a pat definition. Culture is XYZ. Culture is, religion, and culture is food, and culture is language. He says, yeah, it's all of those things, but our understanding of culture is relational. It's like a rich point. In fact, that's his idea, this idea of the rich point. Maybe you've experienced this before. If you leave home and go to, I don't know, Singapore, China, Mexico, and you notice a lot of different things, and then you come back home and suddenly you notice a lot of weird things that you had taken for granted before about your own culture. It's because you come into contact with different systems of classification, different systems of talking, different ways of using your hands when you talk. A lot of different things about daily life in different places don't come into your awareness until you get outside of your ordinary everyday culture. So that's the basics of his view. Statements about how a culture works, if you can say, oh yes, it's this way, Agar says, wait a minute. Culture is always moving. It's always changing. You can't be sure it's going to be the same tomorrow as it is today. Rapid change can happen. Sounds a little like a globalization idea. He says also, be aware of regional cultures, local cultures, and other kinds of variation. Globalization indicates, as we know, stuff is always moving around. Put all that movement together with local traditions and local practices, local occupations, local ways of eating, living, loving, and laughing, and you get a really complicated soup. That's why Agar was interested in complexity theory. So culture may be a handy shorthand to talk about things, but it's a very messy and complicated concept. Cultures are in motion and they depend on your point of view. That's the relational concept I want to leave you with. When you talk about culture, put a plural on the end of it. Cultures anywhere, and you'll probably be safe. Culture is always already plural. It's always already changing. Keep that in mind. So, but what does everybody have in common? All these cultural differences. If we're going to market in China, don't we have to understand Chinese culture? Yes, you do. But what are some things that we all have in common? If we're interested in international marketing, we tend to focus on the differences. But as Douglas and Wynn remind us, there are some folks that think you can standardize, and in some cases you can standardize certain aspects of a product, a service, or a marketing plan. It seems to me that some of the standardization can come from this idea of cultural universals. And in fact, it has other implications as well. What's a universal? What does everyone have in common? Think about it. What is it? What are things that everyone does? Not everyone eats kimchi, but almost everyone has some kind of pickled food. Wait, but not everyone. But everyone eats. But here are a couple of key things that I want you to be aware of with cultural universals. One that is not included in most lists: rituals. All human cultures have some way of marking changes from one status to another, from a baby to an adolescent to an adult, from single person to married person, from living person to dead person. We mark those changes in our human lives in very different ways, but they're always marked somehow. We call these rituals rites of passage. They're actually very important for marketers. Many rites of passage include a lot of gift giving, special purchases of things, special clothes you have to wear. A lot of times a rite of passage will change your identity, which means that suddenly you're not the same market segment that you were before. I'm no longer an unmarried single guy. I'm now a married person. I have new needs. See what I'm saying? Those aspects are across all cultures. Other things, well, we all have sexuality. We all have etiquette. We all have rules about what to eat and when and how to eat, right? In front of whom? Do you eat standing up and walking on the street, or should you sit down and eat? Do you eat at home, or do you eat outside in public? All these things vary, but all the basics are there for everybody. But sometimes it's useful and important to try and break culture into parts so you can compare things around the world. And that's what Hofstede tried to do. Read his article and you'll see where he's going with that. And please also go to the website and try comparing some cultures. What do you mean cultures? National cultures. That's what Hofstede's interested in. He wants to see if, since we're interested in, national differences often are really important. For business people, they're tremendously important. The minute you move a product across a border, new set of rules, new set of tariffs, new set of taxation rules, new set of customs rules, new set of rules about how you operate your business the minute you cross the border. So for Hofstede and for a lot of people in international marketing, understanding national cultural differences can be important. But be aware that Hofstede is missing out on some really important aspects that Agar would want you to pay attention to. There are multiple cultures inside any national culture. Also be aware of where Hofstede is getting his data. He's drawing his information from a survey, which is great. You can actually look at the differences statistically across a sample and see the differences in the way answers to questions cluster. Questions about things that you value, things that are important to you, and that's kind of Hofstede's focus. An interesting and important approach to understanding cultures, but one that's rather different than the others I talked about, Bourdieu and Agar and so on. There's another article you're reading, and it gives you a nice definition of culture, the things people have, say, and do. I think actually Briody and Ferraro, or is it Ferraro and Briody say it's things people have, think, and do. Those three things. Pretty broad, nice to remember. Hofstede defines it kind of in an old-fashioned way, but then chops it up into dimensions. And you can compare cultures on different dimensions, and they have a certain importance, a certain kind of truth value, I think. Who would have expected that Mexico and Japan are similar in their uncertainty avoidance as a general rule, right? Remember that Hofstede is using means-based statistics to come to his understandings. That is to say, there's no one person that fits the model that would be presented by Hofstede's dimensions. They're a statistical average. And there are always outliers on the edges of that normal curve. And often the outliers are where change and interesting things happen. Marketers have to be aware of change and have to be very wary of only marketing to the normal curve. Sometimes you want to target the normal, easy-to-reach customer that you really understand. But for innovation and for a fast-moving market, pay attention to both sides of the curve. Nevertheless, Hofstede, an interesting person and someone worth understanding and looking at. I want to integrate these things a little bit with this notion. Culture is relational. It can be dimensionalized for certain purposes. It should be understood from both a experience distant and experience near way. Experience distant, experience near. It should also be looked at as a two-way street. When you're moving into another culture, people look at you as, oh, here comes an outsider. And you're saying, I'm an outsider coming in here with my ideas. Oh, will we like your ideas or not? You see, two-way street. The folks you're meeting on the other side of that conference table in a new market, you go to Malaysia, are expecting you to be from a place with certain cultural ideas. And what happens when you meet together is those expectations get played out in interaction that's going to be based on trust, one would hope. It's a two-way street. When you do business across national borders, you're entering into a relationship of a special kind, one in which the expectation is that people are coming in good faith and are wanting to listen to one another. And, it doesn't make sense to say, well, I'm going to Japan, I have to be Japanese and speak Japanese. Yeah. You don't necessarily have to do that. You have to understand some basics, learn how to be polite, have some expectations that are in line with reality, but you can also expect your business partners overseas to help you understand what they're about while they're trying to figure you out, right? That plays out over time. We all struggle with difference, but we also want to remember human beings are human beings at a certain level. I think that's an important thing to remember. So with all this talk about difference and culture, I also will talk to you guys about when culture probably isn't the best explanation for anything. Things like financial incentives and institutional structures, which are related and come from cultural things, and it's all tied together. But understanding what differences, whether they're institutional or cultural or language, which differences make a difference is a really important task for marketers. That's all I've got for now. And I showed you just a few slides. The longer slide deck is worthy of your eyeballs. Please look at it. Do the readings. Take a look at the videos. Ah, yes, it's the little video about how Americans eat. I'm going to be putting in a lot of little bits and pieces of American culture. Some of the readings, some of the videos will give you some idea about how daily life is lived in the United States, how customers and consumers understand and use products, that kind of stuff. So watch the little video on how Americans eat. It should be interesting. See if you can find some rich points when you watch that video. That's what I wanted to remind you of. So long until tomorrow. Thanks for coming.